Welcome to Hoop HR Highlights. This is our new podcast channel, which will feature a series of topical podcasts aimed at anybody who has an interest in HR, recruitment, or market updates around South Wales businesses. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Hoop Recruitment or head over to Spotify and subscribe to Hoop HR Highlights. You'll get to know our team here as the series goes on, but as a matter of introduction, my name's Emily Summerhayes. I'm the Director of Professional Services and HR Recruitment here at Hoop, and myself and my members of my team will be hosting a series of HR highlights and inviting some industry experts in to talk about anything HR or recruitment related. So if you'd like to chat with us, please get in touch and we'd love to chat further. Today's discussion is all around the art of the civil service interview. And I'm joined by industry expert Cath, who is the senior recruiter at the Office for National Statistics. So to put some context around why we've chosen to do a podcast on this topic, my team have been working a lot over this past year recruiting for a range of posts within the public sector. We've noticed that there's a huge difference in the recruitment processes to that of the private sector from start to finish. Some may describe it as thorough, but in a candidate-driven market where candidates have got the pick of the roles, we have found that a lengthy process with application forms and panel interviews can sometimes be a bit of a turn-off. And we hear a lot of people say that they put off applying for roles because they feel that the roles may get filled internally. So today we want to make sure in this candidate short market that if somebody is a match, that they understand the recruitment process that they're entering and that they can make the most of the hour that they have to prove themselves. So I thought I'd speak to Cath today to find a little bit more about these processes and to ask if there's a method to scoring well in these processes as well. So before I pass the mic over to Cath, I wanted to do a quick intro. I've known Cath for about 10 years. We worked together at one point and she is actually one of the funniest people that I know. No pressure there, Cath. She's also a very, very good recruiter. And I remember interviewing Cath in 2012 and saying afterwards that it was actually one of the best interviews I've ever seen. So she's definitely the right person for this podcast as I've seen her in action. Cath describes herself as tenacious, fiercely honest, and slightly bonkers. She says she eats a lot and has a very loud phone voice, so you might want to turn your mics down. Hiya, Cath.
Hello, you okay?
Yes, good, thank you.
I loved that intro. It was so professional.
I am trying. Honestly, it's quite hard. I think with podcasts, you think that they're going to be easy, but when you start doing them yourself, it's not actually as easy as you think.
No, this is my first ever one. We've done sort of webinars and things like that, but I've never done a podcast before, so I'm very, very excited.
We'll be fine. We're working it together. I think first of all, it'd be really good to just find out a bit about what you actually do at the National Statistics Office and what kind of roles you recruit for, Cath.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm a senior recruiter here at ONS, and I run a recruitment team, one of many. There's actually about 40-50 people total in our recruitment team. But what my team focuses on is recruitment of analysts. So that could be statisticians, economists, operational researchers, social researchers, or people who don't fit into any of those boxes but have an analytical background. And we recruit those people into a specific division here in ONS, which I had to write down because I always get the acronym wrong. It's their Economic, Social and Environmental Group, ESEG for short. And they've got a huge demand for analysts just because of the scope of the work they do. And they do loads of interesting stuff as well. So it's a really nice role. It's really challenging, but it's great.
Fantastic. And how many of those roles do you think, what's the volume of those kind of roles that you have to fill?
So what's really interesting about my role is I think that there's a thing in recruitment, isn't there, where it's like you might work on a high volume of roles, but they might be quite low skilled, or you might work on a couple of sort of highly skilled vacancies at one time. What we've got is quite a lot of highly skilled roles, so it's volume and high skill level. So at the moment we're looking to fill around 150 roles. That's kind of where we're at this point in time. And we do that through a few different means, different recruitment campaigns, different grades, different levels of seniority. So yeah, it's a real challenge, but yeah, it's good fun.
That's really interesting as well, because I think the ONS has got quite a robust internal recruitment team, haven't you? So it's different to other organisations that I've heard of, because you actually work as talent acquisition partners.
Yeah, so we've within our recruitment team, we all so it works. So I've got my own recruitment team, and we kind of manage the campaigns. But then we also additionally to that have a team of talent acquisition partners. So they kind of work closely with us, and it's our talent acquisition team who would act basically like a recruitment agency. So they go out and contact candidates, sort of assess the market, build up candidate pipelines, do sort of sourcing and Boolean searching and all that, like a real sort of not traditional sourcing role, but more like that really. And they sort of feed into us, but obviously I like to keep my hand in them, so
Yeah.
I really like to talk to candidates and kind of go out and find and build networks myself as well. So yeah, it is quite interesting. And I mean, this is something I could probably talk for a while on, but what we're finding, I think, is a lot of government departments are, from sort of speaking with my colleagues across government, a lot of people are employing that model too.
Yeah.
So we are becoming more, I suppose, commercially minded, to sort of compete with, kind of compete with our private sector counterparts in that space. But there's still quite a lot of variation across government in how those teams are structured, I would say.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it seems to work really well, and it comes across that you really, really enjoy your job as well. I love seeing all your LinkedIn posts; they're great. And what would you say you enjoy most about your role there at the ONS?
I think I was trying to think of an answer to this that wasn't like really cliched. I think what's really nice is seeing a candidate's journey. So we have a lot of people who we recruit at sort of graduate level. So they might come in as graduate level social researchers, but quite quickly, like I've been here 2.5 years now. They get promoted quite quickly, so it's nice to see people's career journey now, where they sort of came in when I started here, and now they're sort of developing their skills and climbing the ladder. So it's nice, like, oh God, this is such a cliche. It's nice to know that you've had like influence on someone's like career journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I thought I was
Yeah.
going to come up with something more original than that then. Sorry, but that's what it is.
No, that's fantastic. It's great that you can, that you're in an organisation where you can really see that, because from what I
Yeah.
can see, there's quite a lot of development in the ONS as well for people coming in. It's
Yeah.
not that they come in and there's a glass ceiling. It's such a large organisation. There's lots of departments. You can go sideways, upwards,
Yeah.
things like that as well. Fab. So I suppose today's podcast is about the interview process. So we've talked about how good it is to work for the ONS, and how do you actually get in the door. So if you could give us a little bit of an insight into what does that process look like? So from the moment somebody sees a job advert online, how would they then get to that get in front of you guys?
Okay, that's a really good question. So, and I can give this generally and specific to ONS, because it's important to say kind of upfront with civil service, we all follow the same recruitment kind of framework. So we use something called success profiles. The good thing about success profiles is that you can find there's loads of information sort of publicly available on it, and sort of how we recruit and things like that. So if you want some light bedtime reading, then feel free to go and take a look at
somebody
that.
find that, Cath, if somebody wanted to find something about success profiles?
And if you just Google it, it'll take you to the the gov.uk page for it. And there's like a bunch of PDF documents on there. And there's also kind of accessible documents as well. So pop it into Google. If not, when this is published, I can share the link as well. But it's really useful. I mean, I would probably, if you were to read everything, it would take you ages. But when you see a role you look at, it's really good to have a look over it. So to go back to your original question, because I've already gone wildly off on a tangent and we're only about 5 minutes in. We use success profiles. So if you see a job that you like, firstly, you have to apply via civil service jobs. We can't accept CVs directly, kind of via LinkedIn or via our email inboxes. So you need to create a civil service jobs account. And you'll be asked, you'll be answered a bunch of initial questions about kind of your eligibility to work and your nationality status. And then you will be asked to supply a anonymous CV. I think that's the first thing people have questions about, but hold that thought.
Yeah.
And also a statement of suitability. The statement of suitability is probably the biggest part of the process where people might come unstuck. But again, holding that thought, the CV and the personal statement will then go to a panel for assessment. And if the panel score it as a pass, you'll be invited to interview via video, and then you will be asked interview questions within the interview based on a set of behaviours which are outlined in the job advert. And sometimes you might have to do a presentation or technical exercise too.
Wow.
Yeah.
So actually,
That's the
even
process in a
before,
nutshell, but I know there's a couple of different facets to it. Sorry, Em.
so even before the fact that they come in for the interview, there's actually a panel that are grading that sort of that application process. So
Yeah.
just to outline as well, because I know you know, and this is me being honest now, I'll speak to people that'll say, oh, do you know what? I saw that I set up a civil service job account and I thought, oh, that's going to take too long, or
Yeah.
you know, I've got to anonymize my CV, that's going to take
Yes.
time. And I think in the reality of it is sometimes candidates and job seekers are you know, they want a job and they're applying for a lot of things that are out there online.
Yeah.
What would you say, how long does that take? You know, how long does it take to set up an account? And when you say you want the CV anonymized, what does that actually mean?
Oh, great questions. Setting up accounts, really, really simple. I think it's probably 5 minutes. With regards, sorry, to anonymizing your CV, it's not that hard. We're okay with you sort of including kind of company names and things like that. It's more the things that you normally include at the top of your CV. So your phone number, your address, your marital status,
Yeah.
your age, that sort of thing. So you can just, you know, the easiest thing to do is probably just cut that part out of your CV and just focus on your work history. So it's a free text box, because I know there's some applicant tracking systems where you have to like input your CV line by line, but it's nothing like that. You can just edit your CV in Word to take out the personal details, and then you can cut and paste it kind of straight into the box.
Okay.
And just to explain why we do that, you know, we operate under really robust recruitment principles, in that we have to recruit in a way that is fair and open. And one of the ways we do that is that we assess CVs on a name blind basis. So our panel of sifters will have your personal statement and your CV and work history in front of you. They won't know who you are. They will only be able to assess your application on what is in the content of your application. And then, like I said, you'll get given a score at that stage, and we'll let you know whether you've been successful in being progressed to interview.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I didn't realise that process was. I suppose today we were here to talk about interviews, but actually I think this part is just as important, isn't it? And when somebody's writing their statement of suitability, and they've uploaded their CV, what would they be graded on? So how would they pass that?
So you will always know in the job advert kind of how we're assessing. So I'm going to talk about ONS, but it's with the caveat that if you're applying for a role in another government department, what you're asked for at this stage, it might vary. Within ONS, by and large, what we ask you to do is write a personal statement based on the essential criteria outlined in the person specification of the job advert. So I think we're all familiar with what essential criteria is. They're sort of the key things that you need to have done or be capable of in order to successfully do the role. So perhaps there might be, you know, 5 elements of essential criteria. We want you to write a personal statement that addresses all 5 of those. And that's where your nice kind of star examples come in. I know we'll talk about that later. So again, hold that thought.
Absolutely.
So it does, you know, and to go back to sort of the original point, it does require some upfront work. It's not just as simple as sort of, you know, hit and send on Indeed. You do have to sit down and sort of, you know, think about examples and think about your work history. But what I would say is that all the upfront work will stand you in good stead for the interview as well. And it helps you decide as well whether the role's really for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So somebody would apply for the position. They get the notification, I'm assuming, then
Yeah.
via email to say that they've been selected for the interview.
Yes.
Is there any opportunity then for this candidate to have an informal conversation or to just speak to somebody at the ONS about, or any of these organisations, about the job prior to coming to a lengthy panel interview?
Yeah, so what we do on every job advert, and this is specific to ONS. I think it's the case across the civil service too, is on every job advert, there's two contacts. There's recruitment team contact and there's a hiring manager contact. And obviously we put them there because, we welcome questions from prospective applicants. And certainly, we pride ourselves in recruitment services on sort of our good kind of knowledge of both the process and the roles we recruit for. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to the recruitment team in the first instance, but you can also reach out to the hiring manager, and often we will refer people on if they have specific technical questions.
That's really helpful as well, because I know, when we work with organisations, we're obviously that middle voice. And I know the amount of questions that we get from candidates about the job and about the departments, about the team fit, so that, then when they get to that panel stage, that the buy-in is actually there. And I know there's some organisations we've worked with recently, we've really advised that they do have these informal conversations, because a panel, it involves a lot of preparation, doesn't it? And and sometimes you might not get to ask those quite informal questions that you would want to know prior to an interview. So that's good to know as well. Okay, great. So somebody comes to their interview. What does the structure look like at the ONS?
Okay, so firstly, the most important thing to say is that we are still interviewing via Teams, via video conference. So what will happen from the start of you being notified that you've been successful at SIF stage, you'll get to go on to civil service jobs and you can book your choice of interview slots. So what happens is our recruitment team put on every available interview slot that the panel's available for, and you can choose one of those. It goes without saying that the quicker you log in, the more choice of slots you're going to have. Thereafter, then you'll get an invite via Teams, which will contain some important information, and you'll be also told if you have to prepare a presentation. So we'll assume for a second that you don't have to do a presentation and it's just kind of a question and answer type session. They generally last an hour, and you will be interviewed by a team of at least two, possibly three people. And you will be asked questions based on the behaviours outlined in the job adverts. Now, behaviours are like competencies. An example of a couple of them would be leadership, or communicating and influencing, or working together. And what you'll be done is you'll be asked a set of questions based on those behaviours. I would say normally you'd be asked maybe between four and six questions generally, and they will either be in the structure of tell us about a time when, and those are the kind of questions that interviewees are generally quite comfortable with. I think they're quite standard. We also ask questions of, when faced with a scenario, what would you do? So we call them future facing questions. So this is a really busy team and you have to prioritize workload. If you got in at 9 a.m. and an urgent piece of work came in, how would you tackle that? That's the kind of questions you might ask too. So for the kind of backward facing and future facing. And you get a chance then at the end, like any other interview, to sort of ask any questions you may have for the panel. So it's quite rigorous in terms of kind of the thought you have to put into the examples, but it's not like a day-long assessment centre or anything like that. It's generally an hour and 15 minutes, and we try and make it as comfortable as possible for the candidates.
So when you're assessing with those examples that you gave there as questions, is it the behaviours you're looking for, how somebody dealt with it, as opposed to what they did and how, the actual situation?
Yeah. So I think that we would probably, the way we would score the sort of past backward facing questions is probably fairly standard. But yeah, with regards to kind of the future facing questions, we are looking at how people would kind of approach a specific scenario. So I think there can be certainly a tendency, especially if you're very well prepared, to say, well, I want to turn this round into an example because I've got an example for this. But we just want to see that you have a systematic approach to things. So, and how you would work with others, how you would work with your line manager, how you would delegate. There's loads of things you can kind of bring into these future facing questions, but we're just needing to know how you would approach problems. And, we always make it specific to the role, so we don't ask something completely random, they're always kind of role related.
So, and what advice would you give to somebody? Like, how long should they take answering one of those questions? What do you think about that? When people go off and maybe waffle a little bit, would you want that to be short, sharp, and succinct, or?
Yeah. It'll come as no surprise to you, Em, that I have a real tendency to waffle in interviews. So I do feel this quite deeply. Generally, we would say for the past-facing ones, so the ones where you're actually given an example of something you've done, we'd say around 5 minutes is a good guideline. We will not be there tapping our watches at 5 minutes, but that's when you're practicing, that's a good time to have in your head. Likewise, for your future-facing ones, we're thinking maybe more 3 or 4 minutes. So again, they're very much guidelines, but that should give you an idea. But that's probably, for me, who tends to waffle a lot, but also for others who maybe tends to be more concise, particularly with your past evidence questions. That's where kind of your STAR model comes in, because what I find personally is I have a real tendency to tail off at the end of examples. So I'll kind of go, and that was kind of it. So that's where the R part of STAR is really important, because if you find yourself waffling, you can think, right, result, I've got to get to the results. But I know we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a sec.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that leads us on quite nicely, because I know we've talked about the STAR model quite a lot. And I know I saw one of your LinkedIn posts a while ago, Cath, and I thought it was brilliant. And I thought I'd read this out, and you'd actually called it an ode to the STAR model, and then you'd put, I hate myself for this. But the poem goes, if you want a civil service role, read this, no need to scroll. If you find yourself rambling and your answers leave the panel scrambling, no need to worry, all is fine. Just use the STAR model every time. Situation, set the scene. Task, what you had to do. Were you a keen bean? Action, what did you do to get things sorted? And result, what was the outcome and what was reported? So I just literally, I can see that you're like sitting there cringing right now, but that was so funny and brilliant, because I think just highlights, I think people know about the STAR model, but sometimes it's like, well, what does that actually mean? So I don't know, you could probably say that a lot better than me. I reckon you could do that in a rap voice as well, Cath. I think it'd be a little more, I don't think I'm cool enough.
Emily can see me on video right now, and she did see me visibly cringing as she was reading that out. I think, you know this feeling well. I think one of the children had me up at about like 4:30 that morning or something, and I think it was maybe midway through the afternoon, and I'd probably lost my mind just a little bit, but it came from a good place. And ultimately, I think it's because we spend a lot of time explaining the STAR model to people. And the reason we explain to people, because it is a good model to use. And as I alluded to earlier, like I said, I have a massive tendency to ramble during interviews. And anyone who's interviewed me will know this is the case. So the STAR model's always been really helpful for me. And we use it you can use it at 2 points in the process when you're applying for a role in ONS. So firstly, we talked earlier about your personal statement and how you address each point of the person specification, or the essential criteria in the person specification rather. So if, for example, one point of the person specification asks for, good communication skills, you can use your STAR model then. So you could say something like, I have excellent communication skills. An example of this was a time when. So hold that thought, because we're talking about interviews and I've gone off on a tangent again. When we're looking at interviews, we look at the STAR model as a way of potentially answering our past evidence style questions. Give us an example of a time when. And the questions will be more complicated than this, but say if the question is, give us an example of a time when you've shown excellent team working ability. So this is where you'd use the STAR model. You'd say, okay, I have excellence, teamwork, and ability. An example of this was a time when. You go to your S. So S is for situation. So that's kind of outlining the situation, kind of, the who, what, why, when, where. The T is the task. So explaining, given the situation, the task that you had to complete. A is action, the action you took to get the task done. And R is result, closing with the result of your actions. The R is the most important part. Like I said, either for people who waffle or people have the tendency to be a bit too concise, it really rounds your answer off nicely. So when we say result of your actions, you could literally be as explicit as you give your example at the end, you say, and as a result, this happened. So maybe as a result, company profits increased. Maybe as a result, things were more efficient. Maybe as a result, you hit a tough deadline. So and it's a good sense test for your examples when you're preparing for interview, because it's a really good test for if your examples are any good. Because if you come up with an example where the result of the action was, everything went pear-shaped and everyone hated you at the end of it, it's probably not the best example to use.
You've said before as well about the depth of examples, that
Yes.
it's important, I suppose. How do you choose the example to give? So I suppose if somebody has got a lot of examples that they could give, how do you know, does that depend on the seniority of the role or?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that can help you there. And firstly, as I mentioned before, kind of the behaviours are outlined on the job advert. So you'll have an idea going into the interview. You won't know what you're going to be asked, but you'll have an idea of the kind of questions you might get asked. So I would, first of all, when you're picking your examples, I would kind of make sure they align to the behaviours. So if we're asking for someone who can show leadership and managing a quality service and working together, those are 3 behaviour examples. You can already probably think, okay, I've got a few examples in mind for each of those. When it comes to picking your right examples, again, as I mentioned at the front, that's where our sort of success profiles kind of literature comes into place. I mentioned, obviously, you can find everything on gov.uk, but what you can find is behaviour descriptors. I was using air quotes then, and I just realised only Emily can see me. Many years.
Good.
So you can find descriptors for each behaviour at each grade. So that'll give you an idea of the depth of example we're expecting. Leadership's a really good example of that, is something that will vary through the grade. I mean, at our entry level grades, perhaps we're only looking for the fact that you could take a leading role in a meeting or on a specific task. Whereas when we're getting up to, say, grade 6 level, which is our sort of highest grade before the senior civil service, we're looking for people generally who can lead big teams with sort of, big reporting lines, doing quite diverse work and things like that. So it's also worth going back to the responsibilities in the job description as well, because obviously that'll give you a flavour of what we're looking for and what the scope of the role is.
So do you, when you ask these questions, is it okay for the candidate to pause for a while to think? Because there's a lot there. There's a lot to think about, isn't it? The questions asked, and I think there's that kind of perception. I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing. So people just start talking. But I would think actually you probably would need to pause and think a little bit.
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. Whenever we do webinars or anything like that, we say to candidates, in an interview, we do not believe there is any such thing as an awkward silence. If you have to take a minute to think of your example, the interviewers will not mind. So you can, and again, the way you can make this feel comfortable for you, say, thank you, I'm just going to take a minute to think of my best example. And you could just be used to sitting with that, because the panel will be used to that. The other thing I would say, and especially for people who are coming in maybe to this sort of first office job, or maybe they've just graduated, I think the questions can sometimes seem a little bit complicated when you first hear them. So ask the panel to repeat the question if you need them to, or if the question's in 2 parts, ask them to, repeat the first and the second part of the question. You can ask them to repeat the question 3 times if you want. You will not be scored negatively on it.
That's a really good tip and good to know. Because I know when
Yeah.
we speak to people after they've had their interviews, we say, how did it go? And quite often the first thing, oh, I had to ask them to repeat the question, or I had to think for a minute and I was pausing, when actually it's really good to know that they're not being judged on that. It's just the
Oh,
quality of the answer afterwards.
absolutely. And like I said, own the pause and own it. And, just it's absolutely fine for people to repeat for us to repeat the question. The good thing about having a systematic approach to interviews, and we score in quite a robust kind of way, is that we're never going to score you down for things like, oh well, they asked me, I had to repeat the question for them 4 times, so they're obviously not a good listener. That's not how we do it. We only score on the content of the answer, and if it takes you 5 minutes to come up with that answer, it's fine. I mean, if you're anything like me, I'm really grateful of this is just the time to have a drink of water or a coffee or something like that, so it's fine. A little sip of coffee.
That's good to know. They're doing it for you, Cath. That's why. So we've talked about the STAR method quite a bit. I'm going to put you on the spot now, and because anyone that's listening might think, oh, this all sounds good, but how do I actually answer a STAR question? So if I was an interviewer now and you were sat in front of me and I said, right, Cath, can you give me an example of a time that you've demonstrated resilience? How would you answer that in the STAR method?
Okay. So first I take my pause, say, it's a really good question, Emily. I'm just going to take a minute while I think of my best example for that. Or in
And
this
I'm going to have
case,
my
I'm just
coffee.
going to exactly have your coffee. And what I'm actually going to do is think of something I can make up. Um, I have a lot of experience of demonstrating resilience. An example of this was actually this morning when my 4-year-old refused to get out of bed for school. The task I had to take, I had to get her up and I had to get her dressed and give her breakfast within about 20 minutes because they lock the school gates. So what I did is I bribed her. I picked her up and I carried her downstairs. I put the TV on for her. And then I promised she could watch my phone in the car on the way to school. As a result of that, we all got to school on time and she walked into the classroom perfectly happy.
Brilliant. You know what, Cath? That sounds like an episode of Motherland right there.
God. It had all the classic hallmarks. And again, this is a mad tangent, but we live just like a kilometre away from the school. So by and large, I try to walk with them every day, but this morning it just was not happening. Like I said, my 4-year-old was not feeling it. She got out of her own bed and into her sister's bed at one point, so I couldn't find her. So yeah, lots of fun.
Typical morning before we start the other job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you ever you mentioned earlier that you have kind of 4 or 5 set questions, which I'm assuming that
Yeah.
you ask the same questions to each candidate.
Yes.
Do you then ever ask, do you divert from there? Are there any probing questions? So if somebody you've asked the question and the person answering doesn't give you quite what you need, do you probe for those answers then?
Yeah, so we ask the same questions to each candidate and also in the same order as well. But yeah, what we also have is we also have when we're putting together the interview questions, we also come up with a list of sort of potential probes as well. So we have that in our head, and certainly I think there is flexibility in that, especially when we're feeling a candidate as all kind of almost getting it, or maybe we just want to know a little additional thing. We do sort of pop in just to clarify things. But yeah, we do ask sort of follow-up questions, but we try to maintain the consistency of those as well. But likewise, we're not robots. So like particularly like if I'm sat on a panel doing analytical interviews, sometimes people will say things I don't understand. So at that point, I'll just be like, can you just clarify that means that or something like that? But we do try to be we are as consistent as we possibly can be, so each candidate has the same experience.
Great. And we've seen actually feedback from roles where a candidate may not have got the position because they didn't seem as enthusiastic for the position. And I know that other civil service companies actually score on things like body language. Is that something that you do?
No.
No.
No, we don't. And there's a reason. There's a part of the reason we don't do that. when we used to interview face to face, one of the facets of success profiles, which I spoke about, was strengths. And strengths are something that are quite innate to you. So they're sort of part of your natural personality and how you react to things. So maybe for someone, this strength might be leadership. And what we would expect to see is when they're asking the question related to leadership, that they're naturally more engaged and they sort of shift in, they sort of like, they shift in their chair a little bit and they're sort of like, right, yes, I know all about this. And the way we sort of ask those questions is that we ask a baseline question first. So we might ask a question about, tell us something that makes you happy. And what we're doing is we're not scoring that question, but we're hoping that when someone's talking about something that makes them happy, we're gauging what their authentic response is. Because everyone's body language is different. And then we would ask a strengths question that would, hopefully show us where their strengths lie. I feel like I've explained that in quite a complicated way, but what I'm going to say is that we don't use strengths questioning when we're using video interviewing. For that precise reason, actually, it's really hard to gauge body language because, and again, just to explain for people listening, Emily can see my face and probably down to my waist, and then I've got a blanket on my lap. So already you can see less of my body language than you would have if we were sat face to face. We have some candidates who are using setups where we only see their head and shoulders. So when we're using video interviews, we don't score on that part of the process. We do use sometimes other mechanisms in place for that. Sometimes we use things like online tests. But that was a really long-winded answer to a really simple question. I think
use the STAR method, Cath.
I should have used the STAR method, really. Emily had time to probably drink 2 cups of coffee during that answer. But to bring it back to the point a little bit better, that's probably where body language does come into play. But like I said, we have adapted because we acknowledge that's really difficult with video interviewing.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. There's other sides of the interview as well, though, isn't there, that you are looking for? So the civil service principles and sort of demonstrating that you've got an interest in inclusion and diversity, and also that somebody's demonstrating the values. How do you measure that within an interview?
With us, and again, this could vary in other government departments. With regards to inclusion and diversity, what we generally do is sort of include it in one of our questions. So like leadership is probably the best example. It is probably the best element of sort of the behaviours where you can ask a question about inclusion and diversity, sort of, give us an example of a time when you've, led a multidisciplinary team and how you've promoted inclusion and diversity. Those questions do come up quite a lot, particularly as you move up the grades, because our expectation is that will be an area of, sort of interest and something that's important to you. So the one bit of advice I think I would give to people, especially when you're sort of coming in at mid-senior level, is if you don't have much of an interest in inclusion and diversity and you want to work for the civil service, you probably need to get one quite quickly. And you need to start thinking of ways that you've promoted inclusion and diversity within your organisation. And like I said, the good thing about, in ONS that we've got a lot of initiatives in place. So it's a really important part of who we are and what we do. But it's something that's really worth starting to think about if you are applying for civil service roles, because yes, there is a chance, and quite a good chance actually, you'll be asked a question about it.
And is that the same, I suppose, for the values? Would you advise somebody researched what the values and the principles were prior to an interview?
I think it's important advice in general to make sure that kind of for any organisation that what we do kind of aligns to sort of our, your culture and values aligned to sort of that of the organisation you're applying to. I think that's really important. And I think also that's where a good recruiter comes in as well, because they can help convey that as well. In terms of asking specific questions, probably not, but our questions would be, designed in a way that we can kind of get a good match in that sense.
And what would you expect from a candidate in terms of preparation before an interview? What's important? I mean, we've obviously talked about the success profiles and looking at the job spec. Is there anything else that you would expect them to prepare?
So if there's anything explicit we want them to prepare, it would be something like a presentation, and we would sort of tell people about that in advance, and we'd be sort of quite clear in sort of our expectations. And a lot of the time, the presentations we ask for are 5 minutes, and they're delivered verbally, so with no PowerPoint or anything like that, which some people can find a little bit daunting, but it's something that comes with practice. Beyond that, I think the best way to prepare for a civil service interview is reread the job advert, because all the information does tend to be in there that you need. And then, start thinking of a few examples, but don't be wedded to them. What I always say to people is, you've got scope when you're videoing interviewing to go full on Kaiser Soze and have like stuff written on the wall behind you and just sort of, read everything off. But actually it finds that having reams of notes can give you sort of more stress. So what we advise is maybe just sort of prepare some cue cards with some notes on.
Yeah.
Maybe sort of, what the behaviours are going into the interview. So maybe make a couple of notes per behaviour. So you're feeling prepared going in, but you're not giving a sort of scripted answer. And the trouble is sometimes where you sort of make too many notes is if you get asked a slightly different question than the one you've prepared for it, people tend to get unstuck then.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. Do you give interview questions before the interview at all?
No.
I know that some organisations have started doing that now.
No, we might, as part of a reasonable addressment for someone with a disability or a long-term health condition, but we wouldn't as standard, no, only the presentation.
Fantastic. Well, do you know what? I think I've learned a lot there from you. Is there anything else in terms of the process that you think would be beneficial for anyone to know going into a civil service interview? I mean, we've talked about the questions and the behaviours. When it comes to, I suppose, the skills and actually showing the depth of skill. So, for example, if somebody was in human resources and they were coming for an interview and they were being assessed on maybe how much they'd done within change management, how would you, assess, I suppose, the depth of their experience in change management through an interview to see if it was right for a job with yourselves?
It depends, really. So it might be something as simple as we ask a question about it in the format we discussed. So, if we think of our forward-facing questions again, in this role, you'll be responsible for a big change management program. Can you tell me a bit about how you would approach that? So that might be one of the things you use. But also, we might ask we would call it like a technical question. So an explicit technical question where, give us a presentation or prepare an answer on what, I don't know, change management principles or something like that. So I don't know about change management. So, and if it was sort of being assessed as maybe part of a presentation or a piece of work, we'd let you know about that up front, but it's also could be something that's kind of baked into the interview questions too. So there's a couple of different ways we would kind of assess that sort of knowledge.
Fantastic. Well, is there any other tips or anything else that you wanted to add?
I think, as someone, obviously sort of I'm kind of in this world day in, day out, but I think what I would say is that, I think, and everything sort of we've talked about is really valid in that sort of, we're in a market that's candidate driven, and it can be as simple as sending your CV over to a recruiter or applying for a job on Indeed. And I think it's just to answer the question of like, why should you put the effort into applying for a civil service role, or particularly within ONS? But I think what's really important to say is, as we've discussed, our process is very consistent, and it's really, and it's kind of step by step, and it doesn't change. So why that's good is that that you'll be recruited fairly, and also that you'll be assessed properly. So yes, it requires more upfront sort of effort, but that it's not going to be a matter of someone not liking something on your CV and popping it straight in the bin. Every application you make to us is assessed properly by a panel of 2 people who are trained. So that's really important, and you'll get a score, so you'll know how far you're away from the mark if you fail as well. Likewise, once you've done that upfront effort, 90% of the cases only have a one-stage interview process. So you know that once that hard work is done and you get invited to interview, no one likes interviews and they're stressful, but by then it's like you do your preparation, then it's an hour of your time, and then you will get a decision and you will get feedback. So I always say, there's no sort of, oh, well, we're still unsure, we're going to invite you to sort of have, coffee with the CFO, and then we want you to kind of meet our cleaning staff, and then we want you to come into one of our team meetings. There's kind of none of that.
Yeah.
Once you've done the interview, it's done, and then you'll get a decision and you'll get feedback. So I think that although it does require upfront work, I think it's a really fair process, and I think overall it's no more of a difficult process than for a lot of other organizations.
Yeah. And it's good that you either get feedback that's positive or you get closure at least on the process.
Yes.
And you know where you are. So I suppose, I mean, leading on to that as my last question, what would you say to people that are maybe in the private sector? Because I found there is a bit of a perception that people think they're not going to get picked because the civil service will only want people that have worked in the civil service or the public sector. What would you say to that?
So there's a couple of important things to say here. I think the one thing is that we do have the ability, and this is something you'll know if you work in the civil service, but won't if you don't. We have the ability to just advertise roles internally. So if we've advertised a role externally, know that we have gone through that process and we are open to looking at people outside of the civil service. So I think that's the first important thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, I think from ONS's perspective, and I'm going to talk about recruitment specifically, is we really value a mix of skills and experiences. And I think that's what makes our team great. I had worked in the civil service before, but only for a really short period of time. And I came to this organisation having spent 5 years in a company that had between 90 and 140 people in it. And it was very commercial. So, and, I've done just fine and I got the job just fine. So I think that I wouldn't be put off by, certainly from that point of view.
That's a really good tip as well. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. But actually, love speaking to you. It's been good to catch up, isn't it?
Nice
talking about what we love. I know. I was going to say talking about what we love. We're sad talking about recruitment. But I hope anyone listening has found some good tips for applying for a job. And I know that if anyone's interested in working specifically for the Office for National Statistics, all the jobs are listed on the careers page on the ONS website.
Yeah.
I know I've found a lot of tips from speaking to you today, especially for candidates around like looking at those success profiles. And it is obviously apparent that you need to research that STAR method. But if you'd like to hear any more of our podcast, please subscribe to Hoop HR Highlights on Spotify, and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye.